Now, I want to get back to working on our bashing layer a little bit, because so far we've been doing everything in a very kind of chunky monkey way in here. And we want to put this stuff together, and basically, when we're doing things with primitives like this, you always eventually run into the issue of combining them into a single shape. And really, there are three ways that you might deal with an issue like this. The first way is to just not do it. Okay, so let's go to a new document here. And first of all, I want to frame this argument by talking about this actual piece of geometry. So look down here. You see this, you've got this kind of piece of I-beam kind of material that comes up here and then meets up with a cylinder at the end. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So anything like this that is largely sort of mechanical in shape, it's prismatic shapes coming together, is generally speaking going to be easiest to do without sub-D. And this is going to drive some people crazy. I know that I work with a guy who wants for everything to be sub-D all the time. Every single thing he models has to be sub-D. Otherwise, he just like breaks out into hives and loses the will to live. And I frankly can't understand it because you don't need it, right? Don't do work that you don't need to do. That's my opinion about these things. I don't like doing work, so let's just avoid that altogether when possible. So, for example, when doing a shape like this, I don't need to maintain quads if I'm not going to be doing any sub-D. The quads thing is really important if you're doing sub-D, if you're doing smoothing. You need to do complex smoothing, then yeah, you're going to need to do that. But in this case, maybe I'll set this round level up really high on these edge bevels. Then I end up with really nice edge rounds without the sticky issue of creating quads. Yes, I've created this crazy n-gon here, but who cares? It's not hurting anything. It's perfectly fine there. Don't worry about it. So once we have those in place, I can actually just delete a lot of these edges. You don't need most of the interior edges of these things. And maybe I'll just make one that comes across right here, and one that comes across right here. And for the sake of argument, I'm just going to remove the other side altogether, so we don't have to think about it. We'll just deal with one side, because this is just a demo anyway. And then we'll connect here and here. The only reason I'm doing this part is because if Moto gets this gigantic n-gon that turns corners and all this kind of stuff, if it's even slightly non-planar, if anything happens, it tends to not work as well. So I just like to break it up into kind of more bite-sized chunks for Moto to deal with. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. And then I can take this area, B for bevel that in, shift-click, bring that in, and we're practically done, right? Looks like I had maybe there was a little issue with the vertex normal there. Move that up a little bit as well, because it's coming off of its normal a little bit. Yeah, seeing some couple issues, but for the most part, that's just fine. Once I have that, then you say, well, but sub-D will let me kind of round off the edges, right? I don't want it to be like perfectly square. Well, there are a couple of ways we can deal with that that don't involve using sub-D. So if I delete that stuff, for instance, and go to the front view, we'll take these edges here, just scale those down to flat-ish. Good enough. Now, if I want to round off these edges, there are a couple ways I can do it. One would be to select the edge, B for bevel, and just do an edge bevel on it. So we're getting lots of little geometry there, but that's totally fine. Who cares? Not a big deal. Now we have a nice, perfect edge round on there. Could do this side too, and round that off, and that looks just fine. And you know what? This method works perfectly. There's no reason to do work. I don't know. Once again, don't do extra work. So if I'm rounding this interior edge, all we need to do is select all of these interior edges. B for bevel. Bevel those. That looks nice. Just make sure you don't hit the tab key on this thing, because then it'll go all crazy. Of course, you don't want that. Now, there is another way to do this. Let's go to the Render tab. Look at this guy rendered. So you can see that now we have one edge that's been rounded over here. This other edge has not been rounded, so it looks a little bit fake because it's too sharp. Nothing would ever be that sharp in real life. So there's another way to deal with this. All we have to do is select the material in question, go down to the very bottom, and there's a rounded edge width. So if we just set that rounded edge width to, I don't know how big those need to be, 2 millimeters, then yeah, okay, so we'll just need to make it much bigger. Let's make it 10 millimeters. There we go. Now you're seeing those sharp edges are starting to look round. 20 millimeters. There we go. So now we have both sides look ostensibly pretty much the same. The difference is we didn't actually have to literally create the geometry in order to get that same visual result. It looks great, looks rounded the way it should, but I didn't have to go to the trouble of rounding this edge and also creating all of those edge loops. So really, if you're modeling something like this, I'm going to recommend that I'm going to undo a bunch of times. I'm going to recommend that you not bother doing all of these little minor fillets, and instead just model to this extent, to where it looks nice and sharp on the edges, totally fine. Then when you go to do the render, just set that rounded edge width to something, and then we'll get those nice rounded edges in the render without having to model them, which is fantastic. And so once again, we were talking about Booleaning shapes together. Well, now it comes around to it. We don't have to actually Boolean this stuff together. If all we need is for these to visually look good, then all we have to do is intersect them. And then when we do the render, if we have a rounded edge width set, then it will round the intersections there between these chunks. You can see that where these pieces meet. Let me just move these a little bit closer. Looks like we don't have quite a clean intersection there. There we go. So it's rounding off all the edges quite nicely, and from a distance, that's all going to look just fine. Let's turn up that rounded edge width to 40 millimeters so it's really round. You can see that it's definitely doing it, kind of welding those together. So I started this video by talking about putting together these, pieces of disparate geometry. I said that there were 3 ways to do it. The first way is to just not do it, and this is my favorite method. So if you are building this kind of geometry that's very rectilinear with just kind of chunks put together, don't bother with sub-D. Just save yourself some time. Do it this way. Now, if you are using sub-D and you can't get away from it, then you do have to think about other methods. There are 2 of them really worth thinking about. So here is another situation where we have 2 things that need to come together. Let me cut these polys, and I'm going to paste them into this mesh. And what we want to do is bring this piece of geometry into this one. Well, the only way to combine these is going to be to manually select the geometry that needs to be connected and connect it. So I would have to go in here and manually select all of these edges and delete those out. Then I need to have, so I've got, if I double click this edge, this is 32 edges. I need to make this 4 edges into 32. So let's think about that. Well, if I'm not even going to do the math. Let's just Shift D. Oops, not D, but Shift D. Set our subdivision mode to faceted. Hit OK. Now we have 8 edges. All right, let's go back. Shift D. Look again. Now we have 16 edges. And Shift D. We'll go back. Now we have 32 edges. And I believe this one was 32 also. Perfect. So we select these 2 guys on both sides. Go over and run the bridge tool. Click in the viewport, and that's going to connect those up. And it's got a very twisted polygon here at each side. Don't worry about that. Let's set our segments up to, say, 3. That's going to look a little bit better. And we could turn the tension up to, say, 100. And the mode, we'll set that to smooth. There we go. So now we get a nice transition, and it is nice and sub-D friendly and quad friendly all the way across. But that works fine in this scenario, but you can imagine how nightmarish it would be to try to do that with a really complicated shape. This is just a very simple example, but if I'm trying to do something more like this, then this is going to take a very long time to do all of these different pieces and put them all together. That's just a lot of work. Enter the third possibility for this kind of thing, and that is to use something called mesh fusion. Mesh Fusion is a plugin for Moto. It's not built into Moto, but it is a highly recommended plugin for anyone who needs to model stuff like this. So in Mesh Fusion, we can do things in a very different way. So in Mesh Fusion, I can start from any all-quad primitive. It doesn't have to be one of the presets listed here in the cubics for Mesh Fusion, but I am going to start with one of the his to just to keep things moving. Let me go down here and find a nice cube here, and I can rotate that. And now we want to combine these two meshes together, right? And the way that we did it before was to just, you'd have to delete geometry and manually hook everything back up. Ugh, yuck. Let's do something else. Select this and this, go to New Fusion, down to Union of Meshes, and kaboom. We now have a union of those two meshes. We get this little tree showing us that these two are being added together. Don't worry about what this tree means. That's a whole other ball of wax. We can talk about Mesh Fusion in a separate video if you want to. But anyway, I can select this strip. This is called a strip, this sort of fillet that we have between here. I can change the strip width, change the strip profile, make it smoother if I need to, or just make it follow very literally, either one. And once I'm happy with that overall shape, we can hide those input meshes. Now we have a nice combination of those two. And not only that, if I show the input meshes, I can change the input geometry, and you can see this updating in real time. So you can imagine as I'm working here, I could select some of these polys over here. And as long as I maintain quads while I'm working and use good methodology, this continues to work, right? So I make this into an I-beam, and all of a sudden, even though these two things are intersecting at an odd angle, look at that. Click the Mesh Visibility button. This stuff is combining really, really nicely. And once I'm done with it, I mean, this is all I need to do, really. This is all, I can work with this. I can move things around, animate them for the most part. This isn't going to make, perfectly clean topology for, say, character animation or something like that. But once we've done with this, I can select the fusion item, go down to the bottom, click Duplicate, and Convert to Mesh. Oh, let me change my quality setting up here to Final Quality. Duplicate and Convert to Mesh. Create Mesh. And that's going to hide the fusion item, so I'm left with just my final mesh. And this is just a normal mesh item. It is all quads. You can see what it's created here. Put everything together in a really nice, logical fashion. It's even going to create UV maps for me for each of the faces and each of the strips. So it's very easy to map graphics onto these things. Man, Mesh Fusion is awesome. I'm just going to say that. Wow, I could say that all day long. Mesh Fusion is fantastic. So those are your three overall methods. Method number one, don't bother combining it. Just use rounded edge width in the material properties and be done with it. The second method is to use traditional sub-D techniques and kind of combine everything together manually. And method number three is to use Mesh Fusion, which is a really super powerful way to go if you're doing a lot of this kind of modeling. Each one of those methods has its own strengths and weaknesses for various types of situations, and so I recommend giving all of them a try. For this project, I think, well, we might do a combination of things. I may use some Mesh Fusion in some of these areas, and I may use some sub-D in some other areas, and I may just not combine certain other things just because it doesn't matter. It's really small stuff. Who cares? Don't sweat the small stuff. If you can't see it in the final render, it doesn't matter. Okay, so that is combining shapes. So in the next video, I'll probably start kind of speeding through doing a lot of these basic shapes down here.